Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Ron Bro with TopStep. I'm happy to be presenting our first webinar of the new year. So today we're going to cover OpenAir invoicing, some tips and best practices. Okay, what we're going to cover today, we're just basically going to cover a lot of invoice-related kind of little nuggets of functionality you may or may not know exist. This really is very beneficial if you are using OpenAir as your customer-facing invoice, as TopStep does. It can also be very useful for internal review of invoices, so that as people are reviewing invoices inside of OpenAir, they can kind of get a sense of what it looks like when it goes out to the customer if you're sending it through a financial system with similar format. So some of the high-level topics will be around invoice number management, expense management, and then we'll talk about a few other kind of nuggets of functionality, such as billing codes and a few more items. So hopefully you walk away today with some sort of new information you may not have known otherwise. So managing invoice numbering, this can always be tricky. You want to have you normally just out of the box, you'll set a sequence, start it at a certain number and sequence by numbers. But what if you want to have multiple sequences? Then there is a couple of options here. You can do a prefix per customer. And this is where you can go to a customer and set it. And we'll show you that in the next screen. Or you can set it on a project level. So let's look at both options. If you're doing it at a customer level, you can basically set the prefix here at the billing information within each customer, in addition to the demographic page where you have all your address information and the contacts records. There's the billing information. Often we see here you're setting the currency of the customer, the pay terms of the customers are common here. But in addition, you can set a prefix for that customer. And then you can use that prefix. This is really helpful if you're doing some sort of regional assignment of invoices and you want to be able to have those all have the same look and feel from an invoice numbering perspective. Another feature is you can actually do this at a project level. We see this where you might have regional organizations, but they may share a customer, but they have their own projects. And so in this scenario, you have an option to be able to go into, and there's a couple of different setup here. There's a custom field that needs to be set up, and it will hold a 3-character prefix. Can't be 2, can't be 4. It has to be 3 characters. And so you would set that 3-character prefix on each invoice. On each project. Then when you generate the invoices, the standard invoicing would kick in. And once the invoice is approved, you could run an action. And this requires a switch in the background to run an action, which will then update the invoice number using the 3-character prefix and a parallel numbering system. So this is another way to do this at a project level versus at a customer level. This is a little more stringent. It does require the 3 characters. If you don't have a 3-character or you incorrectly enter 2 or 4, what you'll end up on the invoice is with a ZZZ, and that's OpenAir's way of saying the 3-character prefix was not set correctly. So just be aware of that. Expenses. Oftentimes we see customers that have 2 different approaches to invoicing expenses. We want to invoice them on a separate invoice to our customers. So if we did hourly work this month and we also had to travel to get to your site, we want to separate those. But when you want to be able to combine those on a single invoice, you can sometimes see where the invoice layout for what you need for time doesn't apply to the invoice layout for expenses. So in that scenario, OpenAir does allow you to create a separate layout that's dedicated for expenses, just like any other invoice layout. And then within the invoice layout for where you're putting your showing your time-based layout, you can then call that invoice layout for specifically expenses. So in this example, We have our hourly charges up at the top, but then at the bottom, we're able to show different data for expenses based on our expense layout. So this gives you the flexibility of being able to combine your time charges or fixed fee charges with expense charges on the same invoice layout, but be able to have a more controllable layout of those items. So very useful. Another thing we see is where you may want to be able to not show as much detail in your expenses. So for example, you may have airfare, taxi, all sorts of transportation-based expenses, but you don't want to have all of those values showing on the invoice. You may want to group them together. So in this way, you're able to actually create an invoice grouping. And you can do that from within the invoice layout. You can create an invoice group, give it a name, and then decide which expense items are part of that grouping. And then, so when you then display the expense item here, transportation, it would include all of the airfare, car rental, ground transportation, mileage, etc., would all get put under one transportation. You could do the same thing for lodging, etc. So this is a way to, again, manipulate what the customer sees, but still have all the relevant detail behind the scenes for being able to run your detailed reports. Using OpenAir to send invoices. We have a number of customers that use OpenAir to send the invoice to, and you used to have to manually attach a PDF to the invoice send feature, as well as being able to manually attach the receipt attachments. A couple of years ago, they gave you the ability to, if you're invoicing expenses and those expenses have attachments in the expense report, you can automatically transfer those. They still are on the expense report, but they will also bolt onto the invoice. And then when you send the feature, you can then send the invoice and it will have a link to the attachments. So this is another really good way of being able to not have to manually cobble together the attachments and as an additional add-on to the invoice. You can do it automatically just through the invoice layout. Retainers. So I was working with a customer recently, and I was talking to them about potentially using retainers for a use case. Went to look in their account, and it did not exist. So it's not generally enabled in new accounts. If you have a business case for it, then it is something you would need to ask support to enable in your account. But what basically the use case here is the customer prepays hours, or gives you a prepayment of dollars against a customer. And then you want to be able to track that prepayment, and you want to be able to apply that prepayment to the invoices where work is done. So this is a really good mechanism to be able to do that and be able to handle that prepaid. So you create your invoice per normal, which will have your hours and your rates or your fixed fee. And then within the invoice, you can apply the retainer amount to pay that invoice down. So then what that does is basically gives that invoice, it's almost like a payment, but it's a little different than a payment, but it behaves similar. And so now you can send that invoice to the customer. They'll show a zero balance. You'll see what the value was, what retainer was applied to that. And you can also report on retainer balances in OpenAir as well as see those within the invoices when you apply them to see what the balance of that retainer is. So this can be really helpful. Again, prepaid balances is generally the use case where this becomes very useful. Retainers are at a customer level. Think customer POs. The difference between customer POs is you can actually assign a customer PO to a customer, but then additionally assign it to a project. Retainers cannot be assigned to projects. However, you can assign retainers to a customer PO. So in theory, your customer PO is provided. You assign that to a project, and then you attach the retainer to that PO. And then that allows when a invoice comes through with that PO, then the retainer becomes available to draw down. If an invoice comes through for that same customer with no PO, then you will not have a retainer that you can draw down from. So in theory, by sidling the two together, you can kind of get a retainer specific to a project, wherever that PO. And it also works with agreements as well, in addition to POs, if you're using agreements to assign to projects and billing rules. So pretty neat function, can work very well. One other note here, if you are an OpenAir NetSuite financials customer, what we often see is where you'll send an invoice to your customer for the prepay amount, and then the customer will pay that prepay amount. And what you can do there is you can actually receive that amount and store it as a deposit in NetSuite. And so then in OpenAir, you just generate your invoices per normal business. You send the invoice to NetSuite. As the deposit is applied to that invoice to pay that invoice to zero, we can have that integrate back into OpenAir and have that retainer for that amount created and applied to that invoice. So there is an integration path between NetSuite and OpenAir for retainers that link to deposit applications in NetSuite on the invoice. Customizing the layout. Typically, we always see customers doing some sort of terminology override. This is really helpful. I'm working with a German customer right now, that needs the invoice to say certain things for their customers that are different from a US-based customer. And OpenAir makes it without actually having to turn on foreign language inside the account. They can go in and change the terminology on their invoice, and they're actually sending their invoices directly to the customer. So very useful in being able to have the customers see what they need to see, but still having OpenAir behave as normal. So very useful to be able to go through and do this. We also see this a lot with taxation, where you're looking to have the tax show up if you're using OpenAir for any sort of light taxing, have it show up in a certain terminology where you want to rename VAT or GST to something else. Manipulating the invoice header. Again, this is pretty common if you're using OpenAir for invoicing, being able to include or exclude the payment terms, being able to show calculated due dates based on the terms set on the customer, being able to suppress the project name if you need to, or show it otherwise, and then being able to add additional fields into. A lot of times we'll see where a customer has a PO and they don't necessarily need the full PO, OpenAir PO management feature, but they just want to basically create a field on the invoice or a field on the customer that stores a PO number or a VAT number or something to that effect that they need to pull into an invoice. So by using custom fields from the invoice header, it'll show you all the available fields on the project as well as on the customer that you can pull in to add to the header. So what's good about this is if the value is blank, for example, if you create a PO text field and there's no PO, even though you've added it to the invoice header here, if the blank, it doesn't even show like a blank. It just doesn't show at all. And it only shows if there's a value on the project on the PO field. So that's kind of a nice, intelligent way for OpenAir to be able to show it or not show it without causing confusion for customers. Some other formatting for invoice headers. You can actually have a header template. You can manipulate the header template by doing customized HTML. So this allows you to be able to change formatting. You can make things bold or italic if you need be. But this is another switch that if you want even more control over what shows up in the header and how it looks, you can enable this header template switch that gives you the ability to further manipulate the header. So this is another option for customizing your invoice the way you want it. There's also a switch that allows you to have a custom header on the bulk invoice create process. So we've seen this a lot with customers, right? They want to show on the invoice for services rendered between January 1st and January 31st. And otherwise you have to go in and either we have to go manually add that terminology to every invoice after it's generated. We've also done scripts for customers where they needed more than just the feature I'm about to talk to you about. But out of the box, if you enable this custom header switch, if it's not already turned on your account, you can actually put in this language that you want to show up on the invoice header and be able to then have it pull in the start and end dates from this is the bulk create option within invoices. So you can bulk create your invoices. You can bring in that custom language. You control which invoice dates are set and counting periods. And so this is a really nice way to be able to add that additional customization to the invoice. This will just appear above the invoice body. So it'll be below the header, but above the invoice body with the details. It would be the same as if you were going into the invoice properties and putting the same language in the invoice properties. Billing code. We always get a question, what is a billing code? Because it comes enabled in all the accounts, it's visible. The benefit of billing codes is really being able to group projects or customers by being able to create invoice groupings. And what I mean by invoice groupings is I'll have a customer says we have a mix of some of our customers are weekly, some of them are monthly, some of them are delivery based, what have you, right? So if you have different scenarios where you need to be able to group invoice creation process for based on time period as an example, you could do it by region to say we want to be able to generate all of my North American invoices first and then others. There's lots of different ways you could benefit from this, but basically on the client and or on the project, it is a 2-character limit billing code, and you store that. And then when you go through the invoice create process, I'll show you here. You'll see here on this screen, there's this billing codes field. So if you enter the billing codes here, and you can enter multiple billing codes, comma separated, it'll only grab invoice data from projects or customers that align with these billing codes. So this allows you to basically do a subset of billing. We also had where, the UK does their own billing, so they do their billing codes, and the US does it. So there's lots of different ways you can use billing codes if you need to be able to group invoice creation. So this is an example of one that we've seen quite often where you have different billing scenarios. You can also use billing codes in pending billing reports. So there's a way to be able to say, show me what's pending to be billed based on these billing codes. Is another use case for this. So it could be very handy for large organizations with multi-jurisdiction or multi-billing timelines. I mentioned customer POs and agreements. Using the full functionality, you can create these agreements and POs, and you can have them display as part of the header. Once you create the PO in the invoice settings, you then go associate that PO to all projects that PO is associated with, and also within billing rules that PO is associated with. And obviously the benefit there is to be able to have multiple POs for a single project or multiple projects for a single PO. You can, if you get a new PO for more funding, you can create a new PO, have the new PO associated with the set of projects, and then be able to create a new set of billing rules that basically take the new PO amount over the cap of the old PO. So very flexible, really good. But the other benefit of the POs is to be able to, when you're creating invoices, you may want to say, I want to create one invoice for PO or one invoice for agreement. So this is another option in the bulk create process of invoices that you can select a PO or an agreement, and it'll split the invoices when you create. It's also could be useful for splitting services from expenses. So if you mentioned earlier, if you want to have expenses and services on two separate invoices, you may create a PO for the services billing and not for the expense billing. And now you can be able to separate your invoices naturally without having to manually go through and pick through what is services versus what is expenses. You can also, once you create POs and associate them to the charges through the billing rules, when you create an invoice, you can automatically see a balance. So in this example, customer POs is renamed the sales orders, which is why that terminology shows, which is pretty common when you're integrating with NetSuite. But in this case, I create my PO, I create my invoice, and then I can see what's my balance. So this is really helpful if you're getting close to the end of a PO amount and you're monitoring that. You need to know, I need to go get a change order from the customer to make sure we have a different funding. We need a new PO for additional services. So being able to display that feature, display that balance could be really handy. Sorry. Also, probably something you've not really used or had a reason to, but there is a good functionality to be able to split charges upon invoice creation. So when you go to, say, create an invoice, it gives you a list of all of the invoices, charges that are available. You can use checkboxes to include, exclude, and you can also use that to split charges. So you could select some lines and say, I want to split this charge, and I want to move keep the remaining, retain the remaining, and move the rest to a different charge stage. So this is a way if you have trying to get to an exact cap potentially, or there's some things you want to write off in some ways. And this is a really good way to do that. You can also do proration as well as just saying retain this amount of money. You can do it by percentage. So you can say retain 50% of the total, move the remaining to a new charge stage, and prorate the charge. So there's a couple of different options for being able to manipulate the charges as through the invoice creation process. In addition to automatically attaching expense receipts to the invoices, so when you use the send feature, you can also automatically attach a PDF. And this was huge when OpenAir put this in place, because a lot of customers don't want to, their IT folks are worried about them clicking on a link. What is that link going to do? And so that was a big pushback when using OpenAir. But because you can automatically include a PDF as part of that email delivery to your customer, now they don't have to click on the link. They can just click on the PDF attachment, just as if you emailed it directly to them. So it allows you to use the OpenAir send feature like an email, and allows you to bypass any concerns with IT saying don't click on any outside links. The other thing that came out not too long ago was the ability to hard code a CC and a BCC email address. And this is handy because when you create this, if you hit the send feature, you can manually add a CC, you can manually add a BCC. But if it's the same person each time, then by hard coding it in the invoice options under the invoice settings, it'll automatically add it to the invoice send form, and you don't have to manually add it. So this is, again, if this is applicable, this could be a time saver, or if somebody forgets or they type the wrong email in by mistake, and this can bypass those problems. And then if you are using the send feature, out of the box, it will come with its own language. That language can be edited and changed to remove the link in the example I gave before, and be able to put a different language in. So under global settings, under display, there are the ability to update the email settings and for invoices. Now, I recently had a customer that asked if they could do this, and I went to look in their setting, in their system, and I couldn't find it. And I thought I was going crazy and realized it's a switch. Of course it is, it's a switch. So I had support enable the ability to modify the email template for invoice sending. And then they were able to go in and add the language that they need to be able to see so that they don't have to keep manually changing it each time they send an invoice. And you can do this at a global level. And then there's also an option at a customer level on the billing tab to be able to have a customer specific email setting when you turn on that switch. So two options there that can be really helpful. Couple of other things that I find very useful, especially since we send our invoices to our customers from OpenAir. The history allows me to be able to go back and say exactly when was the invoice created, when was it approved, who was it, when was it sent to the customer, and then it also show if the customer does click on the link, it'll show when that was done. So when a customer says, I didn't receive your invoice, you say, well, you clicked on the link on this day, and that's really helpful. So that's another nice functionality. And then, although OpenAir is not a financial system, if you are, using payment terms in OpenAir, you can also customize an aged receivable report. So this is looking at the date of the invoice, and then it's doing, it's bucketing the overdue invoices or current invoices into the buckets you define in this report. And so we run this report obviously on a weekly basis, looking at our aging inside of OpenAir for our invoices. So this can be very helpful. Obviously, this only makes sense if you're also applying payments to OpenAir. You can apply payments as payments are collected. You can either integrate those over from your financial system, or you can enter those direct into OpenAir, which will then contribute to an accurate aged receivables report. It also will help anyone that's not in your financial system, your project managers, your client owners will be able to have real-time information as to what invoices are being paid and which ones are outstanding. So this can be very useful. Reminders. So we had a customer come to us and ask if we could automate kind of an email to remind customers to pay their invoices. So, we were able to come up with a way to do that, and we actually deployed that for a couple of customers. So basically we'll go through and it'll look at overdue invoices, and we can determine which customers participate in that or not. But then it'll email those customers with a customized message that your invoices are. So basically it takes the manual process out of it. Now it does require that you have a good business logic and process for being able to determine what goes when and to whom. But if you can come up with that, then we do have the ability to automate those collection reminders. So something to think about for those of you that may be interested. Okay, well, that was our presentation for today. In summary, invoices are a key touch point within your clients, and they do represent your business. Even if your clients are internal and you're internally showing these and they're not client facing, their invoices are really important to make sure you're conveying the right message and the right information. There are lots of features that can make sure you give it the right information in the right format. So leverage those. You can automate where you can by like the BCC, CCC, by being able to have the different invoice messaging. There's a lot of automation options that are there. And then obviously manipulating the layouts. You can have as many layouts as you need. The layouts are pretty easy to work with. You can show detail in some layouts, but show summary in other layouts, depending on what your customer wants to see. So lots of options and lots of power there as well, along with the other features we talked about today. So thank you everyone for your time today. Appreciate it. Appreciate the loyalty to Top Step, and happy to wish everyone a happy new year for 2023. I'm going to stop the recording and see if there are any questions.